Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share stories about creatures thought to be Wendigo. But the stories involving the beings described here is a hotly debated topic online. The cryptids in these stories are described as having skulls for heads and antlers. But there are those in these forums who are adamant that Wendigo, as described by Native American legend and lore, do not have skull-like heads or antlers. I'm not here to argue one point or the other, because these are creatures we know next to nothing about and no one can be an expert on any of the things that go bump in the night. But people are having encounters with cryptids matching this description, a skull-like face and head with antlers. So if these creatures aren't Wendigo, then what are they? Alright, let's get to the first story. The first story of this episode takes place near Tallahassee, Florida. Tallahassee is the state capital of Florida and is located in the northwest part of the state known as the Panhandle, which branches off Florida's main landmass and stretches approximately 200 miles or 300 kilometers. This part of the state borders Georgia and Alabama. The original poster, or OP, and her mother were visiting her aunt, who lives out in the country. The homes in this area sit rather far apart, separated by woods that go on for miles. The OP had gone to her aunt's house with her mom because her aunt needed help mounting a TV on the wall. They were on their way home when they saw something run across the road in front of their car. She describes the being as being very tall and having a gaunt, lanky body. It had a face and a head that looked like a deer, including antlers. They both knew that this thing was not a deer as they watched it run across the road on all fours. Upon seeing this creature, her mother sped up and was going quite fast down the highway, which made the situation even scarier for the OP. They didn't speak for a while, but her mother finally asked her if she saw that thing. The OP answered that she did, and silence once again filled the car. Her mother later brought up that the creature they saw could have been a Wendigo, so she posted the story online to see if anyone could properly ID this thing. This is just one of the posts where the debate I mentioned before takes place over whether this creature is actually a Wendigo. A lot of commenters insist that Wendigo look a certain way and only reside in certain parts of the country. How they know these things to be fact is a mystery to me, but as I said before, I'm not here to argue one point or the other. People are seeing cryptids matching the description in this story, and one commenter said he saw the same thing. He describes the creature he encountered as looking emaciated, being about 9 feet tall, having black orbs for eyes, having extremely long arms and fingers, and being capable of unhinging its jaw. The OP says that what he describes other than the unhinged jaw is exactly what they saw run across the road in front of their car. Another commenter brings up the number of diseases that afflict deer. These diseases can drastically alter the way deer look and their behavior, making them look and act very much like strange creatures from these stories. But our OP insists that she has seen enough deer in her life to know that what they saw was no deer. This brings me back to the question I asked in the intro. If this isn't a Wendigo or a diseased deer, then what is it? Our next story takes place in upstate New York in a rural, forested area near Lake Erie. The original poster was 18 years old at the time the events of this story took place. She didn't have a car or a bike, so she was forced to walk wherever she went, usually to friends' houses. Her encounter on this night was not the first cryptid she saw in this area that she frequented on foot. She says she has also come across spirits in these woods as well. Despite this, she has grown quite accustomed to walking through the poorly lit roads of the suburban countryside at night. Certain parts of the woods she would walk past and through felt spookier than others. On the night of her cryptid encounter, it was around midnight and she was walking to her friend's house with her friend. She lived on a cliff above a creek and her driveway was near an old abandoned house that sat in the woods off the road. The house was known for having teenagers break into it to perform seances, or at least what they thought were seances, and do drugs. As they walked past the house, the OP suddenly got a weird feeling and stopped. Her attention was drawn to the old house. Her friend was about to ask her why she stopped, but she followed the OP's gaze and saw what she was looking at. The house had a wraparound porch that was partially obscured by the woods, but they could see a portion of the porch from where they stood, and on that porch was a large creature. It looked to be hunched over something it was eating and looked to be human at first glance. Whatever it was must have felt eyes on it as it stopped and turned, looking the OP in the eye. It was then that she noticed its deer-like face and the huge rack of antlers atop its head. It stood up then, and just before it leaped over the porch railing and darted off into the woods, she got a good look at this thing's body. Its torso looked like a human male's and was muscular yet lean. It had human-like arms and large muscular deer legs. It moved with tremendous speed when it did run off into the woods. The OP describes its hooved feet running with sheer speed and power, the sound of which still has an unsettling effect on her to this day. She immediately reached for a knife she carried and handed a second one to her friend. They walked back to back the rest of the way, keeping a close eye on their surroundings. They made it to her friend's house and tried to sleep, but the OP laid awake all night. She never saw that cryptid again, but would sometimes think she heard it in certain parts of the woods. She has avoided the area since that day. This is yet another cryptid encounter where the creature is identified as a Wendigo and described as having a deer-like head and antlers, but she is told in the comments that Wendigo don't look like that. I'm not going to ask the same question I asked in the intro or after the first story, but you know I'm thinking it. What do you think they saw that night? Our next story comes to us from northern Michigan. The original poster doesn't say exactly where she lived at the time of the incident, just that she lived in a rural area with her ex-boyfriend and his family. They are Native American and live on Native American land. One evening, the OP and her boyfriend were coming back from a party. They reached the road where they lived, which ended in a dead end where their house was. They were about 150 feet away from their house when she saw what she thought was a deer ahead on the side of the road. This excited her because she loves deer, but as they got closer, about 50 feet away, her excitement melted away. What she saw was not a deer. The creature stood on its hind legs and was about 7 feet tall. Its head was huge and it had an elongated snout. It had patchy fur that was matted down and its body was so sickly and thin you could see its ribcage. She distinctly remembers how human-like its hands were, but it had claws that were nearly a foot long at the end of its fingers. The thing she remembers the most, that she found the most terrifying about the creature, were its eyes. When it turned its head to look at the car, the headlights caught this thing's bright yellow eyes. The sight of those terrible eyes sent a chill jolting through her as she sat frozen staring back at this thing. She couldn't move or look away. All she could muster was, "What the F is that?" Her boyfriend at the time was also caught in a trance-like state, bewildered at what he was seeing, but he snapped out of it and shifted the car into reverse, hitting the gas. He backed his car all the way back down the road. He then turned around and gunned it, speeding all the way back to town. They eventually met up with the OP's best friend and told her that they saw something terrifying. Before the OP could even describe what it was, her friend described the creature to them and it was exactly what they saw. She had seen it too. The OP was convinced then that she had seen this creature and that it was real. They didn't see it again in full, but they did hear it running around their home and saw its eyes looking at them from the tree line from time to time. She eventually broke up with her boyfriend and moved away and hasn't been back to that town since. I will note that she didn't mention any antlers, but if you describe something as looking like a deer, you assume it has antlers. Reading her story, when she says she saw a deer, I pictured antlers immediately. That's why I included it in these stories. She encountered yet another cryptid she identified as a Wendigo, but with the features of a deer. Again, I ask you, what do you think she saw that night? The final story of this episode takes place in southwest Michigan. Again, the OP does not give an exact location, just that the encounter happened in a rural part of the state while she and her uncle were out in the woods hunting. They were sitting just inside the tree line looking out at a sunlit clearing when they began to hear strange sounds. It sounded like howling or an animal crying, so they chalked it up as being coyotes. However, they did not usually see or hear coyotes during the day. They remained in their spot for another couple of hours, and by this point, the sun was starting to get low in the sky. It was then that the OP noticed rustling in the trees across the clearing. Her uncle had fallen asleep in his hunting chair, but she was awake and alert. Just inside the tree line on the other side of the clearing, she saw movement, and it was something big. The large creature lumbered through the trees, many of which were approximately 15 feet tall. It was almost as tall as the trees it moved through. It finally reached a spot where the trees weren't quite as thick, and the OP got a good look at this thing. It had dark gray skin with a dirty white face, walked upright on two legs, and had abnormally long, thin arms that almost drug the ground. The being's head resembled a deer but was a skull with very little flesh clinging to it. On top of its head were two huge antlers. She sat watching this creature, which didn't seem to notice her or her uncle, move from one side of the clearing to the other, just inside the trees. She felt more fascination with this being than fear. The thought to wake her uncle crossed her mind, but she did not want to move and make any noise, potentially drawing the attention of this being. The creature continued on its way, and she realized the situation she now faced was that her and her uncle would have to go in the same direction she just saw this thing go in order to reach his truck when they left. When the sun set, she woke her uncle up, and they began their trip back through the woods to leave. Paranoia settled over her as they walked, but the journey back was uneventful, until they were almost out of the woods. "Do you want to play?" It was a young girl's voice from somewhere close to them in the woods. They both stopped walking and looked at each other. They took off running then and made it to the truck. Driving home, both clearly spooked, her uncle dismissed it as someone being in the woods. Except there weren't any homes remotely close to where they were. She didn't tell him about the creature she saw because she didn't want him to think she was crazy. She later connected the creature and the voice when she did some research online. That's when she came across the Wendigo and how they can mimic voices. They still hunt in those woods and do so on a regular basis, but haven't experienced anything else since that evening. I don't believe the uncle really thought there was someone in the woods. Why would he take off running? I think maybe he was just trying to find a rational explanation for the voice and didn't want to scare his niece. Little did he know what she saw not long before. This is just another in a long list of many accounts with people describing the same type of creature appearing in all four of these stories, with the encountered cryptids having the features of a deer or a skull-like head with antlers, calling them Wendigo. People are seeing creatures out there that match this description, and some online are convinced, arguing tooth and nail, that they are not Wendigo. In some stories, they even exhibit the same mannerisms and tactics used by the Wendigo. According to Native American Algonquin tribe legend and lore, the Wendigo is an emaciated humanoid figure with little to no hair, has a pale skin color, and a mouth with no lips with razor-sharp teeth. It has never been described as having a deer-like or skull-like head or antlers. However, legend is defined as an old story that is widely believed, but it cannot be proven to be true. So we really can't take this as fact and hold these creatures to hard and fast rules. This, coupled with the fact that we know next to nothing about these things and they cannot be studied, we may never know for sure. But for argument's sake, let's say these creatures aren't Wendigo. This again begs the question, if they aren't Wendigo, then what are they? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.